Welcome to Philosophy15. I'm Scott Aikin.
And I'm Robert Talisse.
We're the authors of Why We Argue and How We Should, A Guide to Political Disagreement. And this is the third of three podcasts on what we're calling Mills Maxim. We left off last time with an answer to an objection to Mills Maxim that following the maxim makes you vulnerable to being converted by the views that you think are false or the views that are particularly wrong. There's another objection to Mills Maxim that has been floating around that is worth considering, which is that Mills Maxim puts particular kinds of burdens on vulnerable groups. So, for example, if you take a woman who is concerned with women's rights, if she has a view about women's liberation, she is then, as a consequence, required to have some knowledge of misogynistic views, and particularly ones that hold not just her rights in contempt, but particularly maybe even her in contempt. And so it looks like Mills Maxim puts an extra burden on people who are striving for a kind of liberation that you might say not only are they oppressed, but now they have to really, really know the views of their oppressors very well. What do you think that a million would say back to this?
So this is a good challenge. It's one that I don't think Mill sufficiently attends to. In fact, I think On Liberty can rightly be criticized in general for being much of its time and for being more or less explicitly aimed at a audience of British, educated British, maybe not only gentlemen, but educated British citizens. So here's what I think the maxim allows. So the worry is that the maxim says, in order to know your view, in order to succeed, to fulfill your epistemic duty with respect to your own commitments, you need to know something about the other side, or you need to have a command of the arguments on the other side. The worry is that this seems like it puts undue burdens on already socially disadvantaged people to know the things that are presented as reasons in favor of the very views that drive their oppression. Right? Okay, so being disadvantaged now has the additional burden. It's not just the disadvantage, but it's you've got to go find out.
Yeah,
you got to go listen.
Got to do more research.
Yeah, you got to go listen to what the racists and the misogynists say. So I don't think, though, that the maxim is across the board you go to the source yourself,
right? Good.
To find out those arguments. And I don't think that the maxim is keyed particularly to, if, you've got to go do the research yourself about the things you most care about. I think that all of us who have broadly egalitarian views have this burden, right? That we're supposed to go, and many of us do this, we go and read Aristotle on women and think about the absurdity of the arguments there. We regularly, as philosophers, pick out the elements of views among great philosophers that have misogynistic components and call them out. So it falls to all of us, I think, to have some command or some exposure to what these disreputable, rightly so, views affirm. And I don't know that that requires any particular person who is socially vulnerable to herself or himself expose him or herself to the onslaught of the misogyny.
Right.
In that case, I think there could be a burden. Why couldn't there be on Mills Maxim be a division of epistemic labor in
Great.
this case,
Yeah.
where you say, look, I'm going to report to you what the arguments look like in a way that doesn't reflect the misogynistic, the extra misogynistic animus against you as a person. These are the arguments that are given, and oftentimes they can be shown to be quite flimsy. And many of I take it that in many cases you can see the added extra, the extra rational, the in addition to the purported rational element, the animus is doing a lot of the argumentative
does
work.
a lot of work,
Right.
yeah.
So when you take out the animus and just say, look, I'm not going to report any of the things that Nietzsche says about how bad you are because you're a woman.
Right.
I'm just going to try to give what he's proposing as the arguments. Look at how flimsy they are.
Right.
Why wouldn't that be? It's not a go to the. You must go to the source.
So right. So it looks like, I mean, maybe to clarify this objection just a little bit and say, like, look, it looked like there are sort of two prongs to it. One of them is, you might say, the extra epistemic burden element.
Right.
And it looks like, in a way, this, you might say, epistemic division of labor argument, where you'd say, well, this is just the responsibility of everybody here, and so you don't have a special obligation because you're in one of the vulnerable groups. It's just that if you've got a view, you've got this. The second one is, you might say, less an epistemological or an epistemetric objection. And epistemetric just means the whatever cognitive resources you've got are relatively limited, so you need to be able to use them efficiently. The other argument is more a kind of a moral argument, namely that in coming to know well enough to be able to rebut arguments against you as considerable, for example, there's a kind of, well, for lack of a better term right now, trauma that happens with it. So being faced with that looks like it's a kind of you needing to revisit your own, again, it's not that you're facing the whip, and it's not that you've got that the other person's got a truncheon, but in some cases these are instances of revisiting the trauma of one's oppression, and that responsibility is less an epistemological problem and more just a kind of a moral problem, that we're making people revisit that. So maybe there's sort of two angles to that argument. I guess I'm kind of happy with the first one. Do you have anything to say with the second edge of that argument?
I'm just wondering why the response to the first one couldn't also be you couldn't be sort of like, okay, look. And I think a million can say this, right? The million isn't saying all doors of inquiry are open all the time. There's never anything settled. You never know when some very clever misogynist is going to give a new argument for misogyny, and you got to go and find them out, right? I think that the million can say. And by the way, the principle, even as it's written, doesn't even require you to know all the opposing arguments, right? It just says, if you know only your side, you know little of that. There's got to be some quality control about what kinds of opposition really have to be engaged with.
Okay.
Maybe there's an anti-crackpot rule. You don't have to know the flat Earth arguments, right, in order to have a grasp of your non-flat view of the Earth, right? You don't have to spend time investigating the arguments or what are posed as arguments for, astrology or whatever, to have a command of your anti-astrology picture, right? Okay.
Yes.
So maybe there's a way to temper it that way, but also isn't part of the value of, especially in philosophy, but not only in philosophy, of engaging with first wave feminist texts, for example, including, by the way, Mills' subjection of women, isn't part of the value of engaging with Martin Luther King the way in which the arguments on the other side are engaged by him?
Yes.
Right? or by her, right?
Right, yeah.
Right? Isn't that part? It's that in order to make the case, there was some level of engagement,
Right.
precisely
Still
with
other
the
regarding.
demeaning.
That's right.
Right, with the views that demean, very often self-consciously so. Right, the idea I am bearing the burden of having to sludge through all of the demeaning things that get said,
Right.
for the sake of crafting the right kind of principled reply. That's part of the value of engaging in the text. Is that a revisiting of the trauma of the? Is reading Invisible Man revisiting the trauma of the oppression?
But in these cases, it's reading someone who's defending your view from
Right.
that. I mean, you still have the other side showing up, but would it be, say, for example, reading Schopenhauer on women, or Phyllis Schlafly's opposition to the ERA could be traumatic, or is it?
I guess it could be, but again,
Is it an extra?
Why couldn't one just give the division of epistemic,
Right.
like Millian epistemic labor?
But so here's the problem then, because if you rely on the people on your own side, to folks who are on your side to be able to give the versions of the opposition for you, right? So in these sorts of cases, we say, look, if we're going to do the epistemic division of labor, we're going to allow some folks who maybe have just got a sort of a stronger stomach or something like that for objectionable views to go sludge through them and to find the best arguments and then to present them to us. But the problem is that I've got to worry about that, which is that if we rely on on folks who we see as on our side to present us with the views of the opposition, you might say, at the very least, we're in a sort of a testimonial distance. And we also understand that, you might say, whenever we're communicating with our own side, there are strategic reasons as to why the opposition sometimes can be presented in less than favorable lights. And not just because of the fact that they've got bad views, but because we want to be able to have a better audience. We want to present ourselves as having a better argument.
But then, why wouldn't that just be an argument for saying that people committed to egalitarian aims who are not being demonized in the literature now bear a greater burden?
Yes.
Right? Not merely of just rallying the troops around the egalitarian views, but of getting into the trenches. So
That's
that
right.
the burden, the risk of sort of reliving a trauma, or the sort of having to subject oneself to the berating by the people who hold you in contempt,
and the extra burdens
isn't suffered by. Right? Why wouldn't that?
That seems right.
Well, good. All right. It's the Mills Maxim. Not every principle that's profound and true, and I think intuitive in this case as well, is costlessly implemented. Looks like it's got a real burden.
There are burdens to be burdens to be shared.
Yes. Philosophy 15, folks. Thanks a lot. Talk to you next time.